And inflation hell is coming, so the debt ceiling crisis is resolved, but the world is actually still screwed. Congress has chosen to kick the can down the road, and this endless borrowing is going to create an even bigger crisis. Now, the debt ceiling deal has cleared both the House and the Senate. We are just waiting for President Biden to sign it off, which he 100% will. Now, before you cheer and celebrate, we need to look at the reality on the ground. Yes, the stock market is going up and everything is rallying, but the market is in for a surprise because inflation is not going to come down anytime soon. And if we dig into the gory details of the deal, you quickly understand why higher prices are here to stay, but more importantly, why interest rates are going to stay elevated for much longer. Now, on one hand, we have the Federal Reserve trying to tighten monetary policy to destroy demand. We know that already. They are crushing the average consumer and making credit so tight that no one dares to go out and spend. But on the other hand, you have fiscal policy from the US government going bananas. They have lost control. Biden and friends are going to keep spending and spending. They are wrapping up demand for everything. And this is just going to drag the inflation crisis further. And listen to what Senator Rick Scott from Florida has to say. I voted no today because this legislation will only bury us deeper in debt and does nothing to stop the rampant inflation Biden and the Democrats have caused with their addiction to reckless government spending. And he's exactly right. The bill doesn't stop inflation, it just digs a deeper hole that the whole world has to pay. So I want to go through why the deal is such a bad idea, not just for the United States, but for everyone on planet Earth. And the devil is in the details. The deal will move to suspend the debt limit, and the wording here is extremely important. It doesn't mean raising the debt ceiling to a higher amount. Suspending the debt limit means unlimited borrowing until January 2025. And under this new deal, the new debt limit will be set at whatever level it has reached once the suspension ends. Now, the current debt sits just above $31.4 trillion today. So, in 2 years' time, the debt could be at $33 trillion or even $35 trillion or more. The sky's the limit, guys, and this is pure insanity. So don't be tricked by the good news because it isn't good news. Congress now has free reign to keep spending until 2025. And we need to realize that deficit spending is only going to go up, it's not going to go down. At least with a debt ceiling, there is a pause on this insanity, right? But that is gone for the next 2 years. But let's talk about the spending caps because it's just as ridiculous as the debt ceiling suspension. And as part of the negotiations, the Republicans have forced the Democrats to agree to certain spending caps. Now, this sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? You can't spend money beyond a certain point until you realize just how insignificant those are. Now, the bill caps non defense discretionary spending in 2024, and this means spending on education, transportation, and law enforcement won't rise next year, but it will still continue. And this spending can increase by 1% in 2025, and there's no limit after that. But if we dig into the numbers, this cap won't move the needle because it is not a spending freeze. It is just not increasing the amount. It's like maintaining your gambling debt and then returning to your bookie even though you know you have a problem. It just doesn't make sense. And we can see that over the last 4 decades, non-discretionary spending ranges from 3 to 4% of GDP. And if we compare it to the total amount of federal expenses, it comes in at only 15%. It isn't a big ticket item, and trying to limit it is just kabuki theater at its finest. It's all show and no substance. So understand what this means. The US national debt is still gonna grow. Sure, 15% of it might be constrained, but the other 85% of spending can increase without any limit. But that's not the crazy part yet, guys. We are in a rising interest rate environment. The Fed has hiked rates above 5% within 12 months. Now, new treasury bonds will be issued according to these new interest rates. So, new borrowing will be 5 to 10 times the cost compared to 2020 or 2021. It's not just the nominal amount of borrowing that's going up, the interest payments are also going to skyrocket. And that's a big problem. This is why we are saying an inflation nightmare is coming, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. And there's a reason why everyone analyzes the US economy, right? Why am I talking about the US economy? Because the US dollar is the reserve currency. What Congress does affects the world economy to a big degree. Now, every time America pushes around the interest rates or they start printing money, every country on planet Earth gets affected. Sometimes they get affected a lot. And let's use an extreme example here. If the Federal Reserve prints $10 trillion tomorrow or they jack interest rates up to 10%, there will be instant chaos in a global economy. And no matter where you are in the world, your central bank will be forced to react to protect against what the Fed or the US government does. Maybe they start buying more gold to hedge against inflation, or maybe they jack up their own interest rates to prevent a currency crisis. But the same doesn't apply to other countries. Only America can print money freely. Now, if Argentina suddenly prints $10 trillion of their own local currency, the Argentine peso, the world won't even flinch. The only country that will collapse is Argentina itself. By printing a ton of money, they will destroy their own economy and cause hyperinflation. And that's because the world doesn't hold a lot of Argentine pesos, but they hold a ton of dollars. So when the US government continues to borrow money to fund its deficit spending, they are essentially injecting more money into the financial system. They are not paying down the debt, the amount keeps snowballing up. Now, this next chart is going to shock you guys. You will explain why inflation is only going to get worse. The biggest driver of the US economy is the US government itself. It isn't the average American consumer or foreign buyers, it's Capitol Hill itself. In 2022, government spending in the US contributed to 37% of GDP. More than one third of the US economy is driven by the government itself. And if we look at government spending in 2020, it went well above 45%. For God's sake, guys, it almost hit 50% of GDP. And this was the same time when money printers went burr and the inflation crisis really picked up. So consider the deal that just went down. There's no more debt ceiling until 2025. Congress essentially has a blank check to borrow and spend. And the problem with government spending is artificially increasing demand. This additional demand is conjured up from thin air. Government spending doesn't increase the supply of goods and services. It's a very inefficient way of allocating capital. What you really have is more money now chasing fewer goods, and there's no better example than the final part of the bill, which is just a slap to the face. And if there's one winner from this bill, it's going to be the defense industries. There'll be more tanks, there'll be more planes, and more bombs coming soon. And according to the deal, total defense spending is going to climb to $886 billion next year. That is a 3% increase from the previous budget. Now, the problem with war spending, it is always unproductive. You aren't investing in energy production or infrastructure, you are just spending money to blow things up. If we look at the US government's discretionary spending, a huge chunk already goes to the military industrial complex. Almost half of it goes to defense spending, and it's only going to grow. It is 8 times bigger than spending on either healthcare or education. Let that sink in, guys. So expect more money to point to Ukraine. And for the war to just drag on even further, right? The United States is going to throw endless amounts of dollars to fight the Russians. Just look at the latest military package for Ukraine announced last month. US announces $1.2 billion in additional military aid for Ukraine. It will consist of artillery shells, air defense systems, and counter-drone ammunition. Basically, they are throwing the whole gamut to counter Russia. And the problem is how they are getting these weapons. Listen to this. Procuring from the defense industry is designed to avoid the US military depleting its own stocks. So America is buying directly from the industrial complex instead of giving their own supplies. And this is fresh money pouring into the system. And before you say it doesn't cause inflation, it actually kind of does. In order to build all those bombs, tanks, and fighter jets, you need to source a tremendous amount of commodities. We are talking about oil, base metals, and rare earths, and this in turn competes with other industries and bids the prices of everything up, right? So now we have defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon competing with Tesla or Ford for raw materials. This is why prices across the board are still heading up. And I want us to consider the huge amount of expenditure that is spent on defense, right? America has a global military presence, and this includes 750 bases in 80 countries with over 170,000 troops. There are bases in Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, the UK, and Australia. Just the financial cost of this alone is staggering, guys. So just imagine how much money is being spent to maintain the troops and equipment. And just recently, the United States is going to add 4 more bases in the Philippines. So you can already project how much more the defense budget is going to balloon. This is just the financial aspect alone. Being the policeman of the world is driving the US economy further into debt. Now, obviously, this can't continue on forever, right? America can't afford to borrow endlessly for the next 100 years because sooner or later, the world will be too afraid to lend money to the US. In January 2025, we are going to run into another debt ceiling crisis, except this time, the national debt would have ballooned up. Now, every year, America runs a deficit, and if we observe the trends, it is getting larger and larger as the years go by. Now, in 2022, the deficit hit nearly $1.5 trillion. That is a ton of money borrowed. But notice what happened after the '08 crisis and during the 2020 lockdowns. In order to stimulate the economy, the US government hit record deficits and pumped money into the system. And that's why inflation isn't ending, even though they're telling us it's all under control, right? Don't worry, guys, it's all under control. But it's gonna get worse. This horror story is gonna get a sequel in 2023. We have the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, telling us that deficit spending this fiscal year will hit $1.5 trillion. And that's another repeat of 2022's insane borrowing. By the time we reach 2025, the national debt will reach 34 or maybe even $35 trillion easily. And the fresh money is going to be borrowed at higher interest rates. And this means the interest payments to service the debt is just going to skyrocket. Just take a look at the 10-year interest cost from 2024 to 2033. This new projection from the CBO is just shocking. Over the next 10 years, guys, the US government has to pay $10.5 trillion in interest rates alone. I mean, interest payments alone, right? And where do you think they are going to get the money? They will have to borrow again from the market. And that's why the idea of the debt deal cutting deficits by $1.5 trillion over the next decade is really laughable, right? That's only 150 billion annually. It is a nothing burger when you are spending 10 times that amount every single year. And here's the thing about borrowing money at higher interest rates. It actually makes the inflation problem worse down the road. I want us to view all these interest payments as stored energy. It's like water caught behind a dam. Now, once the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates down, all this additional money, all this stored energy will pour out of bonds and flood into the markets. It will flow into gold, it will flow into stocks, it will flow into real estate. And this is where we'll see the true terror of rising prices. Right now, we don't see how bad inflation will get because the money is still trapped in the US Treasury, it is trapped in US bonds, it's trapped in the Federal Reserve. But once interest rates go down, the money will rush into the real economy and beat asset prices up. And this is where things really take an ugly turn. If the United States keeps borrowing money without control, the interest expense is only going to soar. And the higher it goes, the more money has to be borrowed to keep the game going. And check out how bad the interest expense will be. Today, the interest on the debt is well under $1 trillion. It is not as big as the other categories yet. But just look at how bad things will get in 10 years' time. This is not a joke, guys. By 2033, the interest expense will be $1.4 trillion, and that's more than defense spending and only slightly less than Medicare or Social Security. It's really scary stuff. The problem now is that we are moving towards an era of de-dollarization. Over time, the demand for US treasuries is going to drop. The biggest buyers of treasuries like China, they're going to shrink their holdings, and this will put further pressure on demand. And if this demand drops enough, oh boy, the Fed will have to step in as the buyer of last resorts. You have to print up a bunch of dollars to buy up all these bonds to finance the US government. Today, the Federal Reserve owns almost a fifth of US government debt. It has ballooned up to $6 trillion. And that's how much money that has been printed up from thin air. And the trend is rising. And this tells us that countries are lending less to the US government to the point that the Federal Reserve had to step in. And I'm really afraid that that's the end game. I don't foresee the US government ever defaulting on their debt. They won't default the traditional way by not paying, right? They will just default through inflation by getting the Fed to print money. So we gotta get ready for another inflation shock coming. 2025 might just be the year of reckoning. So let me know what you think. How bad will inflation get? And how will all this end? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.